somewhere in your house right now, there is a small gray lump of a habit that is nearly 10,000 years old. You probably have a pack of it in your bag, your car, or your kitchen drawer. Humans have been chewing something like it since before we invented writing, before we built the pyramids, before we domesticated the horse. But here's what almost nobody knows. The man most responsible for turning this ancient habit into a global industry was not a scientist, not a chemist, and not even American. He was a disgraced military dictator who had just lost a war, was living in exile with nothing left, and accidentally handed the United States one of its most iconic products while trying to invent something else entirely. This is the history of chewing gum, and it starts almost 10,000 years ago on a cold coastline in northern Europe. Archaeologists working near Gothenburg, Sweden, uncovered small pieces of hardened tar stuck with tiny human teeth marks. The tar came from birch bark, heated until it turned into a sticky, dark resin. Testing on the bite marks suggests the person chewing it was a teenager, and researchers believe they were chewing it to ease the pain of a toothache. That was around 9,700 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before almost anything we would call civilization. A Scandinavian teenager was already doing what billions of people do every single day, chewing something just to feel a little better. That instinct did not stay in one place. Thousands of miles away, and thousands of years later, on a small Greek island called Chios, something even stranger was happening. A type of tree called the mastic tree grew there, and when its bark was cut, it wept small, hardened teardrops of pale yellow resin. The people of Chios began chewing it, and it did more than just taste good. It froze bad breath, it seemed to calm upset stomachs, and it left teeth feeling strangely clean. Around 400 BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates, the same man modern doctors still swear an oath to, wrote about mastic as a treatment for digestive problems and infections. For the Byzantines centuries later, mastic became so valuable that it was worth more than its weight in gold. It was locked away in guarded storehouses. Stealing it was punishable by death. The villages on Chios that produced it were built without street-level doors, so residents had to climb ladders just to get inside their own homes, to defend their supply from raiders. In 1822, during the Greek War of Independence, Ottoman forces massacred the population of Chios almost entirely. The one group spared was the residents of the mastic-producing villages, because the Sultan did not want to lose his personal supply. Think about that for a moment. An entire village survived a massacre because someone in power did not want to give up their gum. But while the Greeks were guarding their tree sap like treasure, on the other side of the planet, an entirely different civilization had already figured out something similar on their own. In the tropical forests of what is now Mexico and Central America, the Maya were tapping a tree called the sapodilla. When cut, it produced a milky white latex the Maya called cha. They boiled it down into a chewable substance and used it to fight off thirst and hunger during long treks through the jungle. The Aztecs, who came after them, called this same substance chicle and had very specific rules about who was allowed to chew it in public. Children could chew it openly. Unmarried women could chew it to freshen their breath. But adult men were expected to chew it only in private, because a grown man publicly chewing gum was considered effeminate. If he was caught doing it in the street, historians note he risked being labeled, in the language of the time, unfit to be called a man. Meanwhile, in North America, tribes such as the Iroquois, the Sioux, and other indigenous nations were doing their own version of this with spruce tree resin, chewing it for its flavor and to occupy restless hands. European settlers arriving in the 1600s picked up the habit almost immediately, and by the mid-1800s, an American businessman named John B. Curtis saw an opportunity. In 1848, Curtis began boiling down spruce resin and selling chunks of it as the state of Maine pure spruce gum, believed to be the first commercially sold chewing gum in the United States. It caught on. Curtis eventually built a factory, producing over 1,000 boxes of gum a day. But spruce resin was hard to harvest consistently, so gum makers experimented with paraffin wax instead, cheap and easy to produce, but brittle and completely without flavor. People would chew a piece, spit it out, and dip it in powdered sugar to keep the taste going. It was not exactly a refined experience, and this is where the story takes its strangest turn. The man who would change everything was not looking for a snack. He was looking to build tires. In the 1830s, a Mexican general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led the siege on a small fort in Texas called the Alamo. He ordered his soldiers to show no mercy, and nearly 200 defenders were killed. Santa Anna became one of the most hated men in American history almost overnight. He spent the following decades rising and falling from power again and again, eventually becoming president of Mexico 11 separate times and getting overthrown just as many. By the 1860s, broke, aging, and exiled from his own country, Santa Anna ended up living quietly on Staten Island, New York, in the modest home of a struggling inventor and part-time photographer named Thomas Adams. Santa Anna had brought something unusual with him from Mexico, a large block of chicle, the same tree resin the Maya had been chewing for over 1,000 years. Santa Anna had a plan. He believed chicle could be processed into a cheap substitute for rubber, which at the time was in high demand for carriage tires. If it worked, he believed he could sell the process, fund an army, and force his way back into power in Mexico. He convinced Adams to experiment with it. For more than a year, Adams tried everything. He tried vulcanizing it. He tried molding it into rain boots, into toy masks, into bicycle tires. Every single attempt failed. Chicle simply would not behave like rubber. Santa Anna eventually gave up, slipped back to Mexico, and left Adams holding a warehouse full of chicle and a stack of unpaid storage bills. Santa Anna died in poverty a few years later, having no idea what was about to happen to the sticky substance he left behind. Adams was ready to throw the entire batch away. Then, according to the story passed down by his own family, he stopped at a drugstore and watched a young girl buy a piece of flavorless paraffin wax gum for a penny. He remembered Santa Anna chewing chicle back on Staten Island, purely out of habit, the exact same way the Maya had done for centuries. Adams took a piece of leftover chicle and put it in his own mouth. It was smoother than paraffin. It held its texture longer. It did not fall apart into crumbs. Adams boiled a batch down, rolled it by hand into small unflavored balls with his son Thomas Jr., and convinced a local druggist to sell them. They sold out almost immediately. In 1871, Adams patented a machine to manufacture the gum at scale and opened what is considered the world's first true chewing gum factory. The man who once ordered a massacre at the Alamo had, without meaning to, helped invent one of America's most recognizable habits. If you're the kind of person who enjoys finding out how strange historical accidents built the ordinary objects sitting in your house, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists entirely to dig up stories exactly like this one. Word spread fast. In 1888, Adams' Tutti Frutti gum became the first item ever sold through a vending machine installed in a New York City subway station. Competitors rushed in almost immediately. A druggist named Edward Beeman mixed chicle with a digestive compound and started marketing his gum as good for the stomach. A former popcorn salesman named William White accidentally received a barrel of chicle instead of nuts from his grocer, experimented with it out of curiosity, and eventually created a peppermint-flavored gum so popular it outsold nearly everything else on the market. And then there was William Wrigley Jr., who did not start out selling gum at all. Wrigley began his career selling soap and baking powder and started throwing in free packs of chewing gum as a bonus to convince store owners to stock his products. The gum, it turned out, was more popular than what he was actually trying to sell. Wrigley pivoted his entire business, and by the early 1900s, chewing gum had made him one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Competition pushed the industry even further. In 1906, a chemist working for the Frank H. Fleer Company invented a stretchy new gum formula designed specifically for blowing bubbles. He called it Blibber Blubber. There was one enormous problem. It was so sticky that anyone who managed to blow a bubble needed turpentine just to peel it off their skin. It was never sold to the public. The idea sat unused for over 20 years, until a Fleer employee named Walter Deemer, who was technically just an accountant experimenting in his spare time, adjusted the formula until he found a version that was stretchy enough to bubble, but did not stick to human skin. He had only one dye left in the factory that day, a shade of pink, so that became the color. Deemer called it Double Bubble, and pink has been the unofficial color of bubblegum ever since, for no reason more meaningful than that being the only dye left in the building that afternoon. But here is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it is the part that made this entire industry possible in the first place. Every single piece of natural chicle gum chewed between the 1870s and the 1940s came from the hands of workers called chicleros, deep in the rainforests of Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. Chicleros worked alone in the jungle for months at a time, climbing 60 to 70-year-old sapodilla trees with nothing but a machete and a homemade harness, cutting zigzag patterns into the bark and collecting the sap in a bucket at the base. A skilled chiclero might tap 10 trees in a single day, and the same tree could not be tapped again for another 4 to 8 years without killing it. Because chicleros were paid by weight, many were forced by pure economic necessity to overtap the same trees again and again, ignoring the long-term damage. Historians estimate this practice destroyed roughly a quarter of the highest quality sapodilla trees in the region within just a few decades. For entire Maya communities, chicle was not a side hustle. It was often the only source of income they had. American gum companies imported millions of pounds of this labor every single year, and by 1930, The United States alone was importing 15 million pounds of raw chicle annually, almost none of which reflected fairly back to the people risking their safety, climbing 60 feet into rainforest canopies to harvest it. Then came the First World War, and later the Second World War, both of which disrupted the supply chain out of Latin America so badly that American manufacturers began searching for alternatives. William Wrigley had also convinced the United States military to include chewing gum in soldiers' ration kits, marketed as something that reduced stress, eased hunger, and improved morale on the front lines. Demand exploded at exactly the moment supply became unreliable. So chemists turned to petroleum-based synthetic polymers instead, and by the mid-1900s, most major manufacturers had abandoned natural chicle almost entirely in favor of cheaper, more consistent, factory-made substitutes. The ancient tree resin that indigenous communities across 2 continents had chewed for thousands of years had been quietly replaced by something closer to plastic, and most people chewing gum today have absolutely no idea that switch ever happened. And that switch has consequences that are still unfolding right now. Most chewing gum sold today contains a synthetic gum base built from the same family of polymers used in car tires and inner tubes. Researchers estimate the global chewing gum industry is now worth roughly $48 billion a year, with just 3 companies controlling around 3/4 of that entire market. Around 1.7 trillion individual pieces of gum are manufactured annually. When people finish chewing, an enormous amount of that gum ends up spat directly onto the pavement, where it does not disappear. It hardens, cracks, and slowly breaks down into microplastics over years, sometimes decades. In Rome, cleaning crews report removing roughly 15,000 pieces of stuck gum from the streets every single day. In the United Kingdom alone, councils spend tens of millions of pounds every year just steam cleaning gum off of sidewalks, and surveys have found gum staining on up to 87% of public pavement sites surveyed across England. A 2025 laboratory study even found that a single gram of chewed gum, whether synthetic or so-called natural, released anywhere from 100 to over 600 individual microplastic particles directly into a person's saliva while chewing. The ancient habit that once healed a teenager's toothache in Neolithic Sweden has, in its modern form, quietly become a measurable source of plastic pollution. There is a strange kind of irony sitting at the center of this entire story. The oldest versions of chewing gum, birch resin, mastic, chicle, were prized for thousands of years, specifically because they supported oral health, freshened breath, and came from nothing but a tree. The modern industrial version, built on top of that ancient habit, now spends millions of dollars a year just being scraped off of sidewalks. Some smaller companies and Maya cooperatives in Mexico have gone back to producing 100% natural, biodegradable chicle gum, in some cases the exact same recipe used by the Maya over 1,000 years ago, selling it internationally as a sustainable alternative. It turns out the original version might have been better all along. So the next time you unwrap a stick of gum without thinking twice about it, remember what you're actually holding. A habit that started with a teenager easing a toothache almost 10,000 years ago in a cold Scandinavian forest. A resin so valuable to the Byzantines that stealing it meant death, a substance an Aztec man could be mocked for chewing in public, and an accidental gift from one of the most hated generals in American history, who was only ever trying to build a cheaper tire. 10,000 years, 6 continents, and one of the most ordinary habits on Earth, sitting quietly in your pocket right now. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories hiding inside the everyday objects you never think twice about. Next time, we're uncovering the object that failed for 30 straight years before anyone trusted it enough to wear it.